the year of being not worthy of respect in a democratic society was terrible. This is what it's like to have no protection from the Equality Act and for it to be open season on people with gender critical beliefs.
Hi, I'm Jane.
I'm Maya Forstater.
And I'm Bex.
And we are
Insightful Sisters.
Hi, everyone. We've got TERF royalty with us tonight. We've got Maya Forstater with us, worthy of respect in a democratic society, apparently. Founding member and CEO of Sex Matters. That's just celebrated its 5th birthday, where has that time gone? And she's come in tonight to talk to us about why things haven't happened in the 1 year since April the 16th last year. So, very timely episode. And I'm going to pass straight across to Bex, who's got some questions for you.
All right. Hi, Maya. You all right?
Yes, hi.
So, the best place to start is your own story. And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are already familiar with it. For a lot of us, it starts in 2019. But for you, can you tell us, when did you first become aware of this issue? What was the moment where you peaked?
I think the first time that it really caught my attention was Jenny Murray, the Radio 4 Women's Hour presenter, when she was cancelled. I have a very distinct memory of being in the supermarket queue and reading on my phone that article. I think I must have seen it on Twitter, the article in the Sunday Times for which she was cancelled. And I didn't really know anything about the issue at that point. I had been on Mumsnet earlier when my kids were younger. I'd spent time on Mumsnet Feminist Board. Helped to found the campaign Let Toys Be Toys. So I'd sort of seen that discussion going on Mumsnet, but I hadn't really been paying attention to it. And then Jenny Murray was cancelled. The students campaigned against her being able to speak at Oxford. And so I looked at this article that she'd written in the Sunday Times where she said, trans women are trans women. It was a very kind of soft article. It was trying to be kind and inclusive, but saying trans women are trans women, they should be celebrated as that. They're not women. And it seemed to me perfectly rational and sensible, and I couldn't understand why she was being cancelled for that. And it was Jenny Murray, she's Women's Hour. And so from there I started paying more attention on Twitter and on Mumsnet, and I set up a little list. You can have private lists on Mumsnet, on Twitter, because I didn't want to follow I could see that this was a dangerous thing to follow, so I set up a little private list so that I could follow people who were talking about this. And I called the list Peak Trans, but nobody could see it because it was private. It was my Peak Trans list. And then I remember one night coming across Lily Maynard's blog, who wrote about her daughter who went through a period of saying she was a boy. And Lily Maynard had written all about that experience. And I was I can't remember, it was very late at night. I was just kind of reading and thinking, this is wrong. And so it took about a year from Jenny Murray to me feeling confident enough that I understood the issues, that I knew that I wasn't a bigot, that I knew that it wasn't, a right-wing plot or whatever. And then I started tweeting about it, and quite soon after that I lost my job. Or no, quite soon after that I was investigated at work, and it took 6 months for me to lose my job.
Tell us about that, because that blew up like nobody could have predicted. There was a lot from both sides, wasn't there? There was an awful lot of disinformation and a lot of hate directed towards you. People were coming out with all sorts of allegations about, what you'd done. And on the other side, obviously, there was this upwelling of support. What was it like to be in the middle of all of that?
It was, first there was the 6 months of losing my job, which was before all that. That was, nobody else saw that. That was very isolating, and that was the kind of worst bit. And then I lost my job, and I tweeted about that. And I didn't know at the time, because I wasn't employed, I wasn't handed a P45, I was a consultant. I had no idea that I had employment rights. And then feminist lawyers got in touch and said they thought I did. And it was 8 days from basically when I lost my job and I tweeted about it to us putting in the claim into the Employment Tribunal, which is very quick. And the reason it was so quick is because there is a time limit, and because the the discrimination had been going on over the 6 months in which I was losing my job. So we had to get it in quickly. So, and I hadn't met my lawyer. It was all done on the Twitter back channel at that point, and we put the claim in. And then it took a little while before I started the crowdfunder. And it was when I started the crowdfunder that then people knew about it. It had to be in the newspaper, and just got amazing support, but also, as you say, hate and misinformation. And my lawyers said to me, don't litigate the case on social media. You'll have your day in court. You have the evidence. Just don't argue with these people. So there was all this misinformation out there about, had I abused somebody at work? Had I harassed somebody at work? And this sort of swirling set of stories about me that I couldn't counteract. I couldn't really do anything about them until I got to court. And it took 4 years eventually. So I got kind of used to it.
I mean, the restraint to go through something like that and, to not be able to advocate for yourself. I think that must have taken a lot of bravery, but it must have been quite lonely as well. How important was the sort of sisterhood that you found? Because we've seen this for a lot of women now, and we've seen this across the board, haven't we? That you speak up and you say something very reasonable, and you're met with this backlash that's so extreme and so sort of removed from reality. How important was it to you to have that support in place?
It all happened quite quickly. I didn't really know many people, or I didn't know anybody really sort of in the movement. I'd been following along silently on Twitter for about a year. I went to the trial, stood outside Westminster Magistrates Court, which was the trial of Venice Allen and Linda Bellos. And I took an hour off work in the morning, and went and stood outside and took a leaflet from there and left it in my work, and that sort of ended up in the case. So that was when I turned up at Westminster Magistrates Court, I had a box of cookies. Like, I brought oat cookies because I didn't know anybody, and I thought, well, if I bring some cookies, then I can share them out. Met people like Shelley's sister and Lisa from MBM, and various people who I've now got to know quite well. But at the time, we were just sort of standing out there in the cold, and I was handing out these cookies and sort of sharing stories with people. So that was the first time I'd met anybody. And then I had this sort of 6 months of being isolated at work, and then I lost my job. And when we started the crowdfunder, I'd sort of printed out all of these little flyers for it, and I didn't know how hard it would be to raise the money. And then Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keane, Venice Allen and Julia had organised this event called Lesbians on Chairs. So I went along to that, and in the Q&A I could put my hand up quite meekly, and I said, my name's Maya Forstater, and this applause. I didn't know how many people knew the story at that point. It'd been in the papers, it had been on X, and as soon as I said it, there was this applause, and I was like, oh wow, okay. So that was and then sort of starting to meet people in real life, and then we had COVID, so there was quite a long time of not meeting anyone at all.
So you lost in the first instance, and that decision to say, no, it's not going to end here, we're going to pursue this further. Was that an easy decision to make, or was there a moment where you sort of considered, okay, take the loss?
There was 24 hours of sort of thinking, what do we do next? And the judgment was so awful, and the lawyers were confident that we could appeal it. So we had to go on. So I don't think there was ever really a question of not going on. And then obviously in that 24 hours, J.K. Rowling tweeted. So at that point, there was no question of not going on. But I don't think there was ever really a question of not going on. And that the year of being not worthy of respect in a democratic society was terrible. I mean, that's the bit where you have no protection. This is what it's like to have no protection from the Equality Act, and for it to be open season on people with gender critical beliefs. So I had to go forward.
I think it's incredibly brave. And I mean, looking at where we've ended up, I mean, as Jane mentioned in the introduction, Sex Matters is now celebrating 5 years. Tell us about that. Tell us about founding Sex Matters.
So Sex Matters was founded in 2021. co-founded by me with Anya Palmer, who was my barrister in the case, and with Rebecca Bull, who's a solicitor. And then Emma Hilton came on board, and Michael Biggs and Naomi Cunningham. And the idea, it was born on the train to Edinburgh. So we went up to Edinburgh to talk in the Scottish Parliament, side room of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish women were much more organised at that point than the women in England. And we sort of wanted to go up there and kind of see what they were doing, see if we could help them. But also they'd already organised with their parliamentarians and they were having these talks in Parliament. So Anya and Rebecca, the two lawyers, went up to sort of give the expert view, and I went up to be lived experience, I suppose. And so on the train from London to Edinburgh, Anya said to me, we need an organisation. And Anya worked at Stonewall. She was Stonewall's second employee before it went bad. And we thought about what kind of organisation it should be. And we sort of thought it should be a bit like Stonewall in that it's a professional organisation, it's non-partisan, deals with the media and charities and so on. And, we also looked at Murray Blackburn Mackenzie in Scotland that was doing really good policy work, really good media work and lobbying. And so it's a sort of love child of Stonewall and Murray Blackburn Mackenzie.
I mean, I think it's great. And obviously, congratulations on your 5 years. It would have been impossible to know when you made your first tweet, I suppose, where things would lead. Because for so many women, your case was maybe the first one that they were aware of. It was the moment they peaked. J.K. Rowling coming into the conversation opened their eyes. So many women sort of share that story or that moment of peaking. The landscape has changed a lot. And I know Jane's going to ask you a little bit about the Supreme Court ruling and the fallout. Just as out of curiosity, looking back to April 16th last year, in that moment where the Supreme Court ruling was announced, what was your feeling in that moment? What had you hoped would happen in an ideal world?
I mean, we'd sort of game played what we thought all the scenarios were, and we set up this 1 to 10 scale of what the judgment could be, 1 being losing completely on everything and 10 being winning. And I thought we were going to win, but I thought we'd win at about a 7. So I thought we'd win, but there'd be lots of hedging language around it. And Helen Joyce, my colleague, thought we were going to lose. So we hadn't quite placed bets, but we sort of were managing our anxiety by building this framework. I think it was 11. It is such a tight, clear judgment. And as soon as we were sitting there in the Supreme Court, I was sitting next to Naomi Cunningham, I was kind of holding her hand. And as soon as Lord Hodge started explaining it in the language of certified sex, which is what Ben Cooper had said, biological sex and certified sex, I thought he's got it. And then, they got it. And we'd sat there in the Supreme Court for the 2 days while the judges were listening to it. And you could see, especially the 2 women judges, you could really see the penny drop moments. I mean, I think you could see it if you were watching on YouTube as well. But I was sitting in their eye line and I could just see the penny drop, when they said, they're among the first, they're not the first, but they're among the first female judges to sit on the Supreme Court. And if there was a male judge who identified as a woman, he would not have the same experience that they had. And you could see that they really understood that on a visceral level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to acknowledge that, isn't it? We're barely a few generations into women having equality. And this has come along and is attempting to completely redefine women within law. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in that moment it must have felt like an overwhelming victory. Like, how could anybody misinterpret it?
Yeah, how could they? And it says things like, it says that this is the only way that you can read the Equality Act and not undermine its meaning and purpose. And it says that to read it any other way is to turn the protections against sex discrimination on their head. You're just so clear and powerful, and yet here we are a year later and people are saying, what Supreme Court?
Well, I think this is the point to pass over to Jane to find out a little bit more about that side of the story.
I love that. We asked Fiona some similar questions, and we said we wanted to stop there. We wanted to stop on April the 16th, but sadly we can't. So the landscape's changed, hasn't it? And the language has changed. So initially there was like, yeah, it's a very clear win. The government called it clarification, and there were some wins, weren't there, in those first few days?
I mean, very early on, particularly the sports bodies, the FA, England Cricket Board, and netball all made their female category female only quite quickly, and then Barclays Bank, I think there were a few quite early on, and then it slowed down, and then there's been a few wins as we've gone along. We supported Michelle Dewberry to write a letter before claim
that was
to
the
Virgin.
Yeah,
the gym chain, because she'd been in the gym and there was a man in the women's changing room and she complained, and they said, well, that's our policy. So I mean, that might have been a case that went all the way, but it didn't. They folded straight away and changed their policy. So that, there were some early wins, and then it started to slow down with organisations saying we're going to wait for the guidance.
Do you think it would have been different if the government had been more forthright?
Absolutely. The governments, they sort of made the right noises from Keir Starmer said everyone
from behind a wall.
Yes, everyone must follow the judgment, but then they didn't do anything. And the Government Equalities Office, it's now called the Office of Equality and Opportunity, but they have been promoting Stonewall law within government for the past 15 years. They're the ones who have been promoting government departments to become members of Stonewall Champions and to celebrate the idea that trans inclusion means including people in opposite sex spaces for the past 15 years. And those people are still in those jobs. So, and the government's policies, the civil service policies, which were the ones that Eleanor Francis challenged in the DCMS and DSIT department. She was a civil servant who went to take her employers to tribunal because they wouldn't fix those policies. And they said then, that was 2 years before the Supreme Court, they said, oh, we'll fix those policies, and they didn't. And I think the reason why is because there's so much embedded resistance within the civil service, within the affinity groups, that they don't want to say we were wrong, and they don't want to say no to the people that they've been celebrating and saying yes to for the past 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, you only have to go into Westminster, don't you, and see all the rainbow lanyards. It seems full of them.
Yes, and the Department for Education, which is Bridget Phillipson's department, go in, and in the lobby they've got 2 toilets, which are very clearly, they were male and female toilets. I mean, you go in and they've got cubicles, they've got sinks and cubicles, and there are 2 sets of them, but they're both now labelled unisex because they didn't want to saying that they were men's and women's, but they've got great big gaps underneath the doors and on top of the doors. They don't feel comfortable as unisex toilets. And then they've had to put a sign on the doors of the cubicles that says, please close the door when you're using the toilet. Like women don't need that sign. No. It's only men that need that sign, and that's in the Department for Education. So if at the top levels of government, they won't just take this really simple expectation and clarity in the law and implement it, then why they're sending a message that you don't have to implement it. And similarly, one of the first organisations we wrote to after the Supreme Court judgment was HMCTS, Courts and Tribunal Service, because when you go to court, are they following the Supreme Court judgment? And we had long correspondence back and forwards where they sort of said they were, but they weren't going to have any kind of clarity, on their website or in the, they give information for people visiting the court. And it would be quite easy to say, use the correct toilet for your sex, and there's a unisex option, which is what they've done in Parliament. But they wouldn't do that. And so you've got judges sitting in a building where they haven't been told that the law is clear, and then those judges are making decisions about cases.
Did we find out this week that the judiciary has been trained by Was it gendered intelligence?
Yeah, well, we knew that the judiciary in England had been trained by gendered intelligence, and what the stories that came out a few weeks ago was about the judiciary in Scotland being trained by the Scottish trans organisations. And you can see both so at the time of my first judgment when I lost in 2019, the judgment cited this thing called the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is not the law, but it's guidance to judges on how to treat people fairly and inclusively in their courts. And it covers all kinds of things, sign language, Muslim people who need to pray, or, all kinds of different things that people might need in court. But in 2019, following the training by gendered intelligence, it was completely trans women are women, you must use people's pronouns and so on. And so that's what the judge pointed to in my case as his guidance on the law, and it wasn't the law. Since I won, the Equal Treatment Bench Book in England has been improved immensely, and it's much clearer that people don't have to use preferred pronouns and so on. But the Equal Treatment Bench Book in Scotland is still very trans activist.
Yeah.
And we've seen these judgments in Scotland, the Sandy Peggy judgment, the Maria Kelly judgment, that look like they are influenced by trans activist thinking.
Yeah. Even when there's a win, it's a dragged kicking and screaming, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Sandy Peggy was a partial win, and part of it's being appealed.
Yeah. Well, that brings us on to the number of cases that there have been since the Supreme Court ruling. And my initial thought was that every time there was a court case, well, surely they'll just concede now, because what's the point? I mean, a lot of this is public money as well that they're fighting these court cases with, aren't they?
Yes. And in some cases they do. One of the cases that was conceded after the former Scotland judgment was a claim that Sex Matters brought against the British Transport Police on their searching policy, where they previously had a searching policy where if there was a male officer who identified as a woman and he had a gender recognition certificate, he could strip search women. I don't think you should have had to wait for the Supreme Court
It's
judgment to know
unbelievable
that's
that was
wrong.
allowed.
It is. But after the Supreme Court judgment, they folded on that and they changed their policy. And then we wrote to the other police forces and they all folded on that and changed their policy. So there were situations where organisations did get into line with the law. But then there are things like the Hampstead Ponds, the City of London. Following the Supreme Court judgment, they had a committee meeting and they decided to stick with allowing men into the women's pond, but they changed their policy. The policy that they'd originally adopted in 2019 said, included genderqueer and non-binary, and it was all of these different options. Whereas after the Supreme Court judgment, they tried to tie it much more closely to the Equality Act language, and they said trans women who have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but they're still letting men into the women's pond, into the women's changing rooms, there are cubicles, but there are also open spaces, and into the women's showers, which are open. And they're defending that. So we're going to see them in court.
Yeah, you've just won the right to go back to court with that, haven't you?
Yeah, so initially we lost on procedural grounds. They said our case was too late because they had initially had this policy in 2019, too early because they were consulting and they might change their policy, and also that we didn't have standing because we're not an individual woman. And we appealed on all of those, and on all of those the judge said it's arguable that we were correct. Hopefully we'll be back in court on that soon.
Yeah. But again, public money, they've wasted money on a consultation. They've asked the members, haven't they?
Well, it's not members. I mean, the survey asked anybody, anybody could reply to the link, and it did ask you if you were a swimmer or not. But 32,000 people said that they were swimmers and said that they'd swum there in the past 3 months. Yeah, exactly. It's not credible. And of those people, 60% of them said they were LGB. So, it clearly went out to an activist audience. And I think people were being wishful thinking about whether they'd swum in the pond or not. They may not even have lived in London or have been anywhere near the ponds. But it's not, in any case, it's not a member organisation. There are members of the Kenwood Ladies Pond Association, which is like the user group. But anyone can pitch up and book online, and go for a swim, just like in the municipal swimming pool. You don't have to be a member. There are season ticket holders, but there's only a few hundred of those, not 32,000.
We've had a spate of nurses as well who've gone through court cases since the Supreme Court ruling, and I think they've been really key in bringing this home, haven't they?
Yeah, because I think, everyone knows nurses, everyone uses the NHS, everyone knows that if you have a job where you have to get changed before you can't travel to work in your scrubs. You have to get changed before your shift and after your shift. And it's just a basic expectation that in that situation, women should be able to change in privacy and dignity without men. I mean, it's in the health and safety legislation, but everyone just understands that's just basic expectation. And so, yeah, I think that the nurses' cases, Sandy Peggy, the Darlington nurses, and Jennifer Mellig case, which is a bit different, that's about the language and whether she was willing to call a man a woman. But I think these nurses' cases have been really relatable, and just they get to the heart of how the state is abusing women who are just trying to do their job and just trying to earn a living and help people as nurses.
Last week, I spent most of the week as an observer in Leeds at the tribunal for Faye Russell Caldicott, and that was fascinating because a lot of the questions were about the policy has not been changed 1 year from the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed in the policy.
Yeah. And then you get things from judges saying they don't accept that there's a greater risk if trans women are in women's spaces. Do you understand anything about
No.
men and women?
No, they're very, very, very brave, these people, because I was struck then that case had taken 3.5 years to get to that point. So that poor woman has been waiting for 3.5 years. She's anonymous at work, the pressure that she must have been under. And there were
I know, and because she wasn't public like me, she didn't have, the sisterhood and the support.
No.
You get the abuse, but you also get the support if you're public. And these cases, they drag on, they take over your life, and they're very stressful.
Yeah, I can imagine. So we had the language changed quickly. We went from the clarification phase to suddenly everyone was calling it complex or contentious or controversial. Do you want to tell us what's your visceral reaction when somebody says this is complex?
It's not. It's simple. There are two kinds of people. There are male and there are female. And there are three kinds of spaces: male, female, and unisex. And there are only those combinations. There are no other combinations possible. When in 2022, the EHRC put out its first version of single sex services guidance, while the EHRC still thought that the GRC changes your sex for all purposes. And it was guidance that was moving in the right direction. They were trying to do the right thing, but they didn't have the law right. And we tried to make some easy reading version of that guidance with pictures, and it was impossible to do. It really was complex and nuanced, because you were trying to say, this is a space for women, but there are some men who are women, but you can still exclude them, but you have to exclude them in a different way. And it was just incredibly complicated, and you couldn't explain it with pictures. Then, following the Supreme Court guidance, that's judgment in April, the EHRC put out this interim update in May, which was like 2 pages long, and it basically said what I said: there are two kinds of people and three kinds of spaces. Recently sent that to a company that makes easy reading versions of government documents and asked them to make one. And at first they weren't that keen.
Bet they weren't.
No, but I explained to them about belief discrimination. And so they've sent back we've nearly finished the final edits on it, and it's really good, and it's really clear, and it's really simple, and you can show with pictures, this is the symbol, this is a man, this is the symbol for a woman, this is a woman. Services and employers should provide spaces for everybody. That's either separate sex or unisex. It's a good idea to have a unisex alternative where you have separate sex services. It's not complex and it's not nuanced, but then you have to be willing to say no to people who very strongly feel like they have a right or a desire to use the space for the opposite sex, and they've been told for the past 15 years that they can, including by the NHS, by clinicians and doctors, and by things like the Government Equality Office.
I think things are moving forward in a more positive way, do you?
I do. I think what the Supreme Court judgment made clear was that you cannot make a rule to do the thing that the trans activists want. You cannot make a rule that allows some men into women's spaces. So the only way that you could do that was with ambiguity about the rules. You tell one group of people one thing, it's a female space, and you tell another group of people something else, you're special people, those rules don't apply to you. And you operate on the basis of ambiguity, and that creates risk. But when you move from ambiguity to clarity, you can't go back to ambiguity. So I think in that way it's moving forward. But then there's this risk that in situations where you're not required to have separate sex services or single sex services, you then get organisations saying, well, if we have to be clear, we're not going to do it at all.
Yeah, because the Labour Party Women's Conference, that was one of the first casualties there, wasn't it? Well, we just
Yes,
won't have one.
although they're going to bring it back.
Yes,
I think that
good.
was they had a freak out for a year, but I think they're going to bring it back. And things like the King's Fund, who had this boxing training for young women
Yes.
in Bristol, and when it was pointed out to them that they'd opened it up to anyone who identifies as female, which means you could have young men boxing against women. And in any case, if the point of the thing is to be a way for young women to get started in boxing and fitness training, that's what it should be. And when that was pointed out to them, they said, oh, well, we won't do it at all. And they got rid of it. And the King's Trust, it's what used to be called the Prince's Trust, they raise money specifically for programs to empower young women. They can't then turn around and say, well, we're not going to do that because now the law says when you do something for young women, it has to be for young women. They've raised money on the basis that it's important that they do this, and they need to kind of get over themselves and
Yeah.
start being clear and providing services for women and girls.
Yeah. I remember when I first got interested and involved in this, I heard Helen Joyce say that she'd been shocked by the number of people who don't do their jobs properly. And this, how our institutions have reacted to the Supreme Court ruling is a case in point, isn't it? The fact is there's a lot of people in our institutions who don't want to give a bad news to a section of their workforce or their customers.
Yeah. And I think also, if you give away the language, you give away the ability to do that and to do your job. And quite often what people have done is they give away the language first. Everyone thinks, well, it's just pronouns. Where's the harm? And we've sort of internalized this idea that calling someone he is abuse or harassment. Calling someone male who doesn't want to be called he is abuse or harassment and is a terrible thing and you mustn't do it. And so once you've given that away, you then can't explain why a single sex space should be a single sex space.
Yeah, exactly like the story in the newspapers today about the trans girls in guides. I think it was a Sky story, and I saw it on X, and underneath there are hundreds of comments just saying they're boys.
Yeah, exactly. And then you do see people who do their job. I mean, when the medical regulator, the MHRA, came out with this letter about puberty blockers and said that there are all these risks and that they should stop the trial, it turned out that was one man doing his job.
Yeah,
That was Dr. Jacob George.
yeah,
And so you do get these extraordinary moments of people standing up and saying, I will do my job.
yeah,
And then this kind of cycle of cancellation.
yeah. That's what we need to do. We all need to do our jobs. I think there've been some really positive things. I think the BBC, It's not been a massive change, but they have altered their language, haven't they? I think since the Supreme Court ruling.
They have, and there's been a lot of pressure and scrutiny on the BBC that has moved that both externally and internally. And I think you're right. The Supreme Court judgment makes it difficult for them to cling on to their previous position. And so, yes, it's really important because there are a whole group in society that if they don't see it on the BBC, it didn't happen.
No, I've gone the other way, actually. I don't believe it often if I see it on the BBC. It's terrible. I used to be a Radio 4 addict, no longer. But there are other sort of bright lights as well. I think the younger women coming through, that's been really positive. Connie and the Cambridge women. And I think there's been an awful lot of people shuffling away as well, sort of quietly removing the pronouns from their bios and so on.
Yeah, so I went to the ACIVO conference, which is the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. So it's all the CEOs of charities, of which I am one. And one noticeable thing was nobody announced their pronouns on the stage.
Yeah.
And lots of people came up to me in the tea breaks and said, I think what you're doing is great. Nobody yet said it on the stage. It definitely, and the day I was there was the day that Girl Guides announced that they'd gone that stage of saying boys who identify as girls would not be in guides from next September. And the woman who was sitting next to me, who was a CEO of a charity, like held her phone up to me and showed it to me. And nobody on the stage said this was a terrible thing. They didn't talk about it, but they didn't bemoan it either.
I think there is a real shift, and we've got you to thank and many others to thank for that. I think I'll pass across to Bex because I know she's waiting in the wings. She gets cross if I leave her out for too long.
I sent her hate mail anonymously, if I'm honest, Maya. Okay, so that brings us to our final question, which is the same that we ask every episode. And that is, do you have a woman or women of the moment?
I have two sets. One woman of the moment, I think, is Dr. Julia Long. I think she was prescient about all of this. She said, don't give away the language. She said, call them men. And at the time when she said it, I think a lot of people thought that sounds too mean and too harsh. But I think she was absolutely right, and she's been proved right. And then the other set of women are the young women coming through now. I think to speak up as a young woman in university or in the first job takes so much more bravery than what I did in my 40s. And so all of my admiration goes out to those young women, like the Cambridge women, Connie, all of the young gender critical women who are speaking up now.
Both excellent picks. I love both of them.
Yeah, we love Julia, don't we, Bex?
do.
She's one of our first.
You know,
She's amazing. She's great.
we all get to Julia Long eventually.
Yeah.
But everyone starts off somewhere else and they get to that position.
She's
It's
so
so
nice
true.
as well,
Yeah.
isn't she? She's just a lovely, lovely person as well.
Yeah. And it's so true what you say. Like when she said, don't give away the language, a lot of people sort of thought, oh God, that's quite extreme. And I'm sure I can, find a reasonable middle ground. And I think we had to learn by experience, some of us, what she clearly knew all along.
Yeah.
Yeah, she is
Amazing
really
woman.
clear. So are we to be hopeful? Do you think that the Supreme Court ruling will be enacted fully in the next year or so? Or is that too ambitious?
I think onwards and upwards. I mean, I think it's only going in one direction, but I'm not sure about fully. But I do think they're going to move in a pack. I mean, all of these organisations are saying we're waiting for the guidance. What they really mean is please don't sue us.
Yeah.
And what they've worked out, their calculation is if they move or if they don't move, they could get sued. And at the moment, the less risky thing is not to move.
Yeah.
But once they start moving, I think they'll all move together. They just want to not be sued.
Yeah, that compulsion at the moment is not to be the first over the line, but very quickly it will change to being not wanting to be the last to sort of move in the right direction.
Yeah. Tanya de Grinwald talks, doesn't she, about the corporates really having had enough of all this stuff. And I think that's really positive. And also the figures coming from America showing fewer young people identifying. It's a fashion. And it's
Yeah, absolutely. And even, even the polling on what do young people think about this, that there is an age gradient with young people being more pro-trans, but it's not the majority.
It's going out of fashion for sure. Right.
Yeah.
Well, we will end there. Maya, thank you so much for joining us.
amazing.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.